Good morning. Maybe you've had this experience, maybe not. It probably happens to pastors more often than it happens to most people. But I don't know if you have ever walked into a building or walked into a room where there are other people and other discussion going on, and suddenly the conversation stops. So what just happened there? Did you just walk in on an argument? Or maybe they were talking about something that they didn't want you to hear, or maybe they were talking about you. And what do you do next? How do you cover that awkward moment? Maybe you go on in and act like nothing happened. Maybe you try and excuse yourself and leave as soon as possible. Maybe you apologize and try and start your own conversation. Anyway you do it, it's kind of an uncomfortable space to be in. On the other hand, I've had the opposite experience as well, although less often. I've arrived somewhere and have been welcomed enthusiastically with more enthusiasm than I probably deserve, but it's still heartwarming. It's like when you go home for Christmas and your family is really, really glad to see you. The last time that I can think of when this happened is when I visited Peter Miller in the hospital the time before he went in, before his death. I had stopped by in an evening, and Peter was sort of a dramatic person anyway, but I came in the doorway and he said, I looked in the doorway and I thought, could it be? And it was you! And I thought, wow, Peter, I'm your pastor. This is like what I do. But he was so delighted that we had a wonderful visit, and it's a memory of him that I'll cherish. Both of those experiences are experiences of liminal space. Now, if that term isn't familiar to you, the word liminal comes from the Latin limens, which means a threshold. A threshold is that piece of wood underneath a doorway that marks the transition from one place to another. Sometimes it's from one room to another, or it can also mark the transition from the outside to the inside. It can be a literal physical space, such as concrete as moving through a doorway from one room to another, but liminal space is also an emotional and a spiritual space. And our text from Luke tells a story which captures both the physical and the emotional meaning of liminal space. It's a story you've probably heard before, but isn't always told as part of the Christmas story. It's found in the first chapter of Luke, beginning in verse 39, and I want to tell it to you again. Immediately before this story, Luke tells that an angel named Gabriel appeared to a young woman named Mary and told her that she would conceive and bear a son and name him Jesus. Jesus would be great, and he would be called the Son of the Most High. Now, Mary is a little bit puzzled by this because she's a virgin. But the angel assures her that it will be all right. Look at her cousin, Elizabeth, who is very old and has conceived a child in her old age. With God, nothing is impossible. So Mary agrees to carry God's son, and the angel leaves. And then Luke uses his little storytelling phrase, and in those days. He goes on to say, starting in verse 39, and in those days Mary set out and went with haste to a Judean town in the hill country, where she entered Zachariah's house and greeted Elizabeth. Now, we don't know exactly how much time passed before the angel appeared to Mary and before she set out to go to Elizabeth's house. Christian tradition says that it happened in the springtime, probably April. See, March 25th is 9 months before December 25th. So March 25th is the Feast of the Annunciation, the day that the church remembers that Gabriel came to Mary. But we don't know. The legend is that this newly pregnant virgin set off across the Judean hills, and flowers sprang up wherever her feet touched the ground. That is a wonderful story. It was probably just a little bit more complicated than that. After all, this was an unwed teenager who had just found out that she's pregnant. And the father of this child is definitely not the man that she is engaged to marry. This is a society where pregnant, unwed teenagers can be put to death for committing adultery. At very least, Joseph would break off his engagement and disgrace Mary and her family. We don't know. Luke doesn't tell us. Did Mary tell her family she was pregnant before she left to go see Elizabeth? Or maybe she was running away to escape the anger of Joseph at her betrayal and her family's shame and disgrace. Mary, on her way to Elizabeth's house, was in that liminal space between what had been and what was still to come. Every pregnant woman, every family that's expecting a child has to live in that space. In fact, every life transition takes us through liminal space. Here are some other liminal spaces in our lives. I'm sure you can think of more. Graduation, moving away from home, losing a job, starting a new job or career, buying a new home, marriage, divorce, being overwhelmed by debt, illness, the death of a spouse or a child. Just reading that list makes me feel a little bit anxious. If you have experienced 2 or 3 of those things in the last year or so, God bless you. Those are stressful things in our lives. They're not all bad things, but they're all things that make us anxious and unsettled. Catholic priest and writer Richard Rohr, who's no relation to our Rohrs, says liminal space is a unique spiritual position where human beings hate to be, but where the biblical God is always leading them. It is when you have left the tried and true but have not yet been able to replace it with anything else. It is when you are finally out of the way. It is when you are between your old comfort zone and any possible new answer. If you are not trained how to hold anxiety, how to live with ambiguity, how to entrust and wait, you will run. Anything to flee this terrible cloud of unknowing. Liminal space doesn't necessarily mean something bad has happened or is going to happen. It just means that we're in between what we know and what we don't know yet. If we don't know what's on the other side of the threshold, but we know that we have to leave something behind. If we can't tolerate that uncertainty and try and run through that doorway, we may lose the opportunity to learn what that transition has to teach us. Here's the next part of the story, and it's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. Mary calls out a greeting as she comes to the doorway of Elizabeth's house. Elizabeth, her much older cousin, is also miraculously with child. And Elizabeth's unborn child leaps for joy inside of her. And Elizabeth says to Mary, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." And anyone who has grown up in the Catholic tradition or ever said a Hail Mary is familiar with those words of blessing and joy. And Mary responds with her own hymn of joy, which we know as the Magnificat. And this is why we invite joy into our lives, and why we are reminded to be joyful on this third Sunday of Advent. Like it or not, things are changing. Things always change. God is always leading us, inviting us into liminal spaces, taking us through doorways into places where we have never been. Our impulse may be to deny that anything is different. Doorway? I don't see a doorway. Or just refuse to go. Nope, I'm staying right here. Eventually, we have to go. Even if we get there kicking and screaming, we have to leave our old comfort zones and go somewhere else, especially when we don't know what's there. Here's an exercise which I have found helpful when I feel overwhelmed or discouraged by transition or change. I look for signs of joy. Sometimes I have to look pretty hard, and sometimes the signs don't seem that significant. But I find that the more I look, the more joy I see. God has scattered signs of joy throughout my life. But if I'm feeling so injured or so discouraged that I don't look for them, I can miss the things that God has given me. It takes a conscious effort to do this. Joy may be all around it, but if we don't make the effort to look for it, to invite it into our lives, we might not even know what God has sent and we have missed. Let me give you an example. Imagine for a moment, if you can, how difficult it is to visit a church where you have never been. For some of us, it's been a long time since that's happened. For some people in this room, like those from the Christian Motorcycle Association, it's happening right now. Can you imagine how difficult it is to walk into a space and worry about how you might be dressed, or if people are going to be friendly, or how much money you don't have, or how you ought to behave? What if you're not really sure that God can accept you? Can you imagine how difficult, how much courage it takes to walk into that space? That is a liminal space, for sure. And even for someone like me, who has spent a lot of time around church, it was sort of a deal to go a couple weeks ago to a church that I had never been to before and hardly knew anyone there, and make a presentation. And let me tell you, it wasn't great preaching or terrific singing or good snacks at fellowship time that made me feel welcome there. I mean, those are all great things for a church to have, but what made me feel welcome was to be invited with joy. We are called to extend a hand of welcome to help someone cross the threshold from their old lives into a new life, to put a hand out to help somebody come from the outside into the inside. Let me give you a suggestion today. Or maybe it's a challenge. That depends on how seriously you take me, I guess. Invite someone to Creekside. It doesn't have to be someone who's never been here before. It could be someone who grew up in this church and hasn't been back for a while. It could be a member who doesn't come regularly anymore. It could be somebody who would like to come but doesn't feel comfortable driving themselves, but would come if you offered to pick them up. Our Christmas Eve service at 7 o'clock on the 24th would be a great time to invite somebody to Creekside. But that's just part one. If we invite people, then we have to commit to welcome them with joy, whoever they are, wherever they come from, whatever their past history has been. An unwed, pregnant teenager was invited into Elizabeth's house, and Mary's child changed the world. We don't get to pick and choose who comes as guests to our doors, but we do get to decide whether we meet them with suspicion and lock the door, or whether we invite them in and welcome them with joy. I want to close with a poem that was written about 800 years ago by a Sufi mystic, Jalaluddin Rumi. Now, this guy is obviously more enlightened than I am because I still struggle with this. But I invite you to listen to this poem and see if you can receive it with an open heart. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. When we can be grateful for whatever comes and learn what it has to teach us, then we will have truly invited joy into our lives and into our world. Amen.